If you want to get started in music production, you're going to need a DAW, a DAW, a digital audio workstation, or music software, whatever you want to call it. Here's a list from bedroomproducersblog.com of free DAWs, music softwares. I've personally used Linux Multimedia Studio and Audacity, and I'm currently using Ableton Live 10 Standard, which is a paid DAW. If you're just getting started, you should download a free one and see if you like making music. Don't spend money straight away. See if you like it first. I've got a lot to cover here. I'm just going to start in Ableton and just explain what I do to make a track, and then I'm going to go over some more technical stuff. So this right here is a track, and you'll encounter that in basically every single DAW. This is a place to put audio or MIDI. MIDI is basically data that you use to tell the computer what notes to play. You do that by entering notes into a piano roll. When you're making a clip, you want to double click on it here in Ableton, and now you're looking at the piano roll. It's basically a piano turned on its side. It's got 10 octaves, so it goes from -2 to 8, and that's basically the same 12 note names repeating 10 times. If you click this little blue headphone icon up here, it'll let you hear the notes that you're playing, but I'll turn that off for now so as not to distract from what I'm saying. Scales are an important thing to understand before you start putting in notes. Here's a diagram from musicmotivated.com just showing a few different scales. The C major scale is a very common, very popular scale. That's right at the top here. This scale contains the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then back to C. And if you're looking at a piano, that will be every single white note on the keyboard. There is something called a relative minor. Relative keys are the major and minor scales that share all the same notes but have different starting notes or root notes. C major and A minor are just one example of relative keys. Major scales sound happy, minor scales sound sad. The root note, or the tonic, as it says here, of each scale is basically the note that you start with. It's the key of the scale. It's the note that you start with and finish with, and it creates a sense of finality. Like if you play a C and then an E and then an A and then back to C, it'll feel like the little musical phrase has come to an end. There's this good website called autochords.com. Just ignore the AI stuff. This is a very useful website for learning about chord progressions. So if we're playing in the C major scale, I'll click C for the key, major here. You could do C flat major or C sharp major or C natural, which is just C major. Flat means you're playing one note to the left on the keyboard of whatever key it is. So if it's C, one note to the left, one key to the left is flat, and one key to the right is sharp. So for now we're going to be playing C major. It gives you some options for mood. It'll show you some ideas for chord progressions. A chord progression gives you a sense of progress in the song, like you're moving from one musical place to another. And it also, if you hover over the name of the chord, it'll tell you what notes are needed to build that chord. So if we're building this progression, our first chord will be C, and the notes in the chord need to be C, E, and G. So if we go back to our piano roll, we can enter in a C, and we're actually going to change the grid size to 1 bar to make it easier to put the notes in. The next note we need is an E, and the next is a G. And then we can go back, and what are the notes in this? An F, an A, and a C. Okay, the next notes need to be an F, an A, and a C. And then the G needs a G, a B, and a D. A G, a B, and a D. And then this chord progression actually has another G. So let's just do what it's telling us to do and just add in another G chord. So these are all major chords, and major chords sound happy. It would be a good opportunity now to talk about intervals. Intervals in music are basically the distance between different notes. In this diagram from pianolit.com, it explains what intervals are dissonant, meaning they don't sound good together, and what intervals, or two notes played together, are consonant, meaning they do sound good together. A minor second interval is one semitone apart, or one half step apart, and that means one to the left or right, one key to the left or right of whatever key you're talking about. A major second interval is one whole step, or one whole tone away from the note in question, and it goes all the way up to an octave, which is 12 notes away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's this thing called chord inversions. It's an option you have when you're building chords. You might want to take a note from the chord and move it up or down an octave in order to change the shape of the chord. If you invert a G chord, it'll still be a G chord, but it'll just be inverted. And there's a diagram here that I saved to help explain this. So if you take a G chord and you do a first inversion on it, you're taking the G, which is the root note of the chord, the bottom note, and you're moving it to the top. That's going to create a certain amount of instability in the chord. It's not going to sound as solid and stable as it would otherwise. And then a second inversion is moving the next bottom note, what has now become the bottom note, the B. You're now moving that to the top as well, so moving that up an octave. So if we do that to the C chord, then we'd be taking the C and we'd be moving it up here. And that's a first inversion, like this diagram, taking the G and bringing it up here. That's a first inversion. And now you can see that the chords are in a bit more of a line, so that might be preferable. You might want to do that, so they're not all poking all weird directions. That's up to you. Another thing we can do is add bass notes. We can add a C below the C chord, because C is the root note in the C major chord, so we can add a C below that, and that will sound stable and harmonic and consonant, and it won't sound weird. You can get more creative with it, of course, but we're going to just stick with simple stuff for now. And then under the F chord, we're going to add an F, and then the G, we can add a G, and then another G. So that's very simple. Now we've added one track with MIDI data into our project. We can now add a bass instrument. I'm just going to choose something randomly here. What I'm going to do for time's sake is I'm going to Control and C. I'm going to copy that clip, and I'm going to Control V, paste it into this new track, this new MIDI virtual instrument. And I'm going to delete the chords and just leave the bass notes and see how that sounds. It is what it is. We're not going for perfection here. This is just for demonstration purposes. Now we can add in some drums, keeping it simple. Just going to choose something random here. I'm going to Control C and V again, but of course delete these bass notes. Now the piano roll for a drum kit is set up differently. Instead of different pitches or notes, it's different sounds that you would find on a drum. So the kick is the foundation really of the drum kit. It's the bassy thudding sound. So I'm going to change the grid to 1/4 notes, and then change my selector from a mouse tool to a pencil, so I can draw them in like that instead of double clicking. So I'm going to just drop kicks in 4 times in every bar. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a common time. As you can see up here in the time signature, we've got a 4/4, which means 4 beats in every bar, and each beat is 1/4 note. So this grid is divided up into quarter notes, and there's 4 kicks, 4 beats in every bar. The bars are divided by different shades of grey. And the tempo up here is set to 120 by default in Ableton. And so if you play that, you'll hear the kick. It's common to add a snare on the 2nd and 4th beat of every bar in a basic 4 to the floor beat like we are setting up here. Once you create something very basic, you can of course mess around with it and make something more complicated. When you're starting out, it makes sense to start with something very simple and then try and expand on it from there. So I'm going to add a snare to the 2nd and 4th beat of the bar. Currently, all of the notes are quantized, meaning they're snapped perfectly to the grid. If you wanted to do it a bit differently, if you wanted a bit more of a natural feel, you could turn the grid off and then slide the notes around very slightly. We're going to leave it simple for now and just leave them snapped to the grid or quantized. Hi-hats are another very common part of drum beats, so I'm just going to add a closed hi-hat. Don't know why it's called yoga, but whatever. I'm just going to add them like that, 1 over each beat. I'm going to add a new instrument for the melody, let's just say brass. And I'm going to Control-C, copy the chords clip into the brass, soft horns brass virtual instrument track. And I'm just going to delete these. Now for the melody, the notes that you're able to use, because we're playing in C major, are going to be the white notes. If you go to Scale Generator and you type in whatever key you're in, C major, you'll see what notes are in that scale. And these are the notes that you can use to build your melody. For C major, it's very simple because you're just using the white notes. And C is the home or root or tonic, and that's what note you're going to come back to every time, and it's going to sound solid and final when you get there. So I'm going to change the grid to, let's say, 1/16. And I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm going to move up to another octave because the melody should usually be high pitched compared to the other parts of the track so that it stands out and draws attention to itself. So I'm just going to draw in something random, trying to stay in key, but not caring too much about what I'm really doing because it's not that important. With melodies, you're going to want to make something that sort of rises and falls. So it might be like la 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. So there's a rise and then there's a fall and a rise and a fall and there's variation and there's this sense of conclusion at the end. So that's the sort of thing you'd want in a melody to keep it interesting and engaging. You want it to change slightly here and there, but be recognizable enough in each iteration so that it's not totally confusing and you know kind of where the music is going. So I'm just going to keep on adding random notes here and there. I really don't care currently about what it sounds like. I'm just chucking them in. And also, if you wanted to quantize these, let's say you'd moved this to an odd place and this to an odd place, and you said, you know what, I kind of regret that. You could select all of these and right click and then quantize so you can snap them to the grid. And I'm going to snap them to the 1/16 notes. So now they're snapped to the grid. That'll do. I'll just give it a listen. Basic and boring, but it'll do. So now that you've got some kind of thing, got some kind of layers going on, you might want to select all of those and Control and D to duplicate, or right click and duplicate. It might vary depending on what software you're using, but you're going to want to create progression. Just like on a smaller scale, you've got chord progressions. On a bigger scale, you've got the progression of the song and how it evolves as it goes. And, you might want one section to be longer than 4 bars. It really should be. It should maybe be 16 bars or so. It should be a decent length. You don't want it to, just keep looping and get really boring. But I'm just keeping it short for this demonstration. You might start out with just the chords and the melody. So let's just delete the drums and the bass so that it can come in later and make the track more interesting. That's the bread and butter of building a track, is adding things in and taking them out, and creating a sense of energy and the ebb and flow, creating a sense of life, like things are popping in and then they're leaving, and the different combinations of different layers are going to create different textures. And then you might want to change up the chord progression you're using, or switch to a different musical key. Just keep building it out until it feels finished. 3 minutes is usually, it's a pretty common length for a track. You can add effects like risers, at the end of, let's say, 8 bars or whatever section, your verse or your chorus or your bridge section or your intro. You might want to add like a riser to like basically prepare the listener for something that's about to happen. Like, oh, it's like the energy in the track is rising. This sound is getting louder, like something's about to happen. And that might happen, here. And it's preparing the listener for something that's about to happen. Usually an increase in the track's sense of energy. So you might want to add an effect, but just to add, if you wanted to add audio, like pre-recorded audio, you could insert an audio track, and then you could drag an audio file from your desktop or whatever file or folder and drop it in there. It's good to have a project folder so that you can put all of your files, audio and whatever else, in that project folder, so that you don't lose the files. Like, let's say you have some audio and you've dropped it in here. If you don't have it in a folder with the Ableton project or whatever software's project, you might end up losing the audio, and then it won't be connected to the project, and then your whole project will be messed up. So it's good to have them all in the one folder and not to keep moving them around. Even before you drop them in to the project, you should put them in the folder that you want them to be in and label them in a way that isn't confusing. And all of these things are just good file management, and it helps to make the musical process less confusing. Also, it's good to save the project very regularly. Try not to get so wrapped up in the making of the music that you forget to save, because if the software crashes, and sometimes the software will crash, it's extremely frustrating to lose, let's say, 3 hours of work on a track because you were just so wrapped up in it that you forgot to save. It's heartbreaking. So try not to do that. Try to remember, get into a good habit. Control S usually is how you save. It's the shortcut, and just get into a muscle memory habit of Control S, Control S. It even if it seems like it's too much, like you're doing it too often, that's better. Even if you wear out your Control S on your keyboard, that's better than accidentally losing all of your progress. So let's talk about effects now. First off, I'll just talk about MIDI effects. This is an effect that will change the way that the computer is going to interpret the MIDI data that you've put in. I'm going to talk about an arpeggiator because it's pretty simple. It just basically breaks up the notes into basically smaller parts, and if you use it on chords, it will break up the chords into notes playing in ascending and descending patterns, and it can be very fun to mess around with. You can change how short the little bits are that it breaks it up into and things like that. So I'll just give you a demonstration of what it sounds like when I add an arpeggiator MIDI effect to the grand piano virtual instrument track. You can also add a limiter. You can just reduce the volume or the gain. Gain and volume aren't the same thing. Gain can affect the tone. If you increase a lot, you can create distortion and things. Volume is just volume. It's just how loud. So gain and volume aren't the same thing, but a lot of the time it acts quite similarly. It's going to make it louder. dB is a loudness measurement. You can also add a reverb effect. Reverb and delay effects work by taking the dry signal, i.e. the unchanged audio signal, and copying either the entire signal or a small part of it. These copies, called wet signals, play at set times after the original dry signal is played. This results in one or more echoing sounds. The main difference between reverb and delay results from the number and timing of their wet signals. Reverb happens when a sound is absorbed, then quickly reflected off many surfaces. Because of the time differences between waves as they arrive at your ears, they form a short and subtle but complex echo. This process usually lasts only 50 milliseconds. As a result, your ears hear reverb as a single sound. Like reverb, delay is based on a natural echo, only instead of a quick series of sound reflections, it consists of slower single reflections. Your ears can easily detect the differences between these audio signals. So now I'll give a practical demonstration of reverb and delay and what the difference sounds like. So I'll just click this S on the brass horn track, which means solo. So that means this track is the only track that we'll be playing. You can also click these yellow buttons here, and this will mute and unmute tracks. And this red button arms it so that you can play the MIDI instruments on your keyboard. But anyway, I'll mute it here. I'll add a reverb effect, and the dry and wet. Dry means it's not having reverb added to it, and wet means it is. And so the more wet it is, the more reverb is being added. It means more of the audio signals being passed through this effect and being reverbified. So let's just set it to 100 and you can hear what it sounds like. So now if we turn that off and add a delay effect, you'll see the difference. So you can tell the delay is distinct reflections, distinct echoes, and the reverb, it's harder to separate each echo. It's all basically one sound. Another thing that's good to think about is velocity. Velocity is how loud the note is. So if you go into your piano roll, down here it will give you these sliders and you can bring them down. So that second note is loud, but if I bring it down. Another important effect is EQ. So if I add an EQ effect, if you want to basically reduce the amount of high-pitched sound, you might grab this little button here on this equalizer or EQ and bring it down. And when you bring it down, it's reducing the volume or gain of those high frequencies. So you're cutting out those high frequencies. You might want to do the same for the low frequencies, and you're cutting out those low frequencies. So on the left is the low frequencies, and on the right is the high frequencies. And that would be giving it a boost. That would be increasing the high frequencies. And it's worth watching a whole video on equalizers and messing around with them and understanding what they do. This is a useful diagram from producerhive.com. So it explains what each range of frequencies contributes to a sound. The range of human hearing goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Hertz refers to frequency. Outside of that range, we can't actually hear. You can just cut those off usually. You can shape the frequencies in each of your instruments or the overall track to your liking, and it helps to understand what each frequency range contributes to the overall sound. So when we're talking about frequency, it helps to understand what sound really is. So here's a helpful little diagram. This y-axis is air pressure, and the x-axis is time, but the white line represents normal atmospheric pressure. And when a sound wave passes through the air, it's going to create points of high pressure and low pressure. One cycle is a sound wave going from one point of pressure back to that same point of pressure. One level of pressure back to the same level. So it could be low pressure returning to low pressure. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. Y-axis is the amplitude, so the more pressure is created by the sound, the louder the sound will be. And also you can see the high frequency sound is faster, so there's more cycles happening over time. And that means this is higher hertz. That means more cycles per second. Panning is a very common effect used in music production, where you can basically send the sound into one ear or the other ear, or one speaker, the left speaker, or the right speaker. You can use the utility effect in Ableton to control the left to right balance. Down here in the utility effect it says C, which stands for center, and if I just play a note here and turn this all the way left and then all the way right and all the way left and all the way right, you can hear it switch between one ear and the other. There are some ideas that are common about panning and what you should pan. The vocals should be in the center, not panned left or right. The pads and whatever, like effects and stuff that isn't central, that isn't as important to be focusing on, that's okay to push out to the sides, but it's best to do that with high pitched sounds. For the kick, the bass, and the snare, as you can see on this diagram, it's best to leave it in the center because it creates a sense of stability in the track. And after talking about panning, it makes sense to talk about stereo versus mono. In stereo, there's 2 channels of audio, and in mono, there's 1 channel. The 1 channel is being split up into both speakers, and stereo audio has 2 different channels going into the left and right speaker. Another useful effect, before I stop talking about effects, is a gate. A gate cuts out the audio once it reaches a certain volume. So once the volume falls to a certain point, the gate just shuts off and mutes the track. So that can be useful if you're recording like someone talking and you don't want the audio to be playing while they're not talking. You just want their voice to be audible. I want to briefly touch on modes because it's something that I find confusing, have found confusing in the past. The 3 major modes are Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian, and the 4 minor modes are Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Remember, major means basically they sound happy, and minor means they sound sad. Major modes are major because the 3rd note in their scale is a major third above the tonic. Major third is referring to intervals, like I was saying earlier, and the tonic is the root note, the home note. And the minor modes are minor as the 3rd note in their scale is a minor third above the tonic. Modes are just variations of the major scale. When you play a major scale, you always start on the root note. To create a different music mode, you play the exact same notes, just starting on another note rather than the root. The Ionian mode of C major is starting on C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, but the Aeolian mode of C major starts on A, so it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The Aeolian mode of C major is actually A minor, so that's the relative minor of C major. Here's a good article explaining what the circle of fifths is and why it's important. The circle of fifths is the concept that Western music is based on. It illustrates the relationship between scales in a way that is hopefully easiest to understand. Here's the circle of fifths. I know it looks scary. It's because it is. I'm joking. You'll get your head around it. When going clockwise, each key is a fifth above the last. So you see the keys are around the outside and on the inside, C, G, D, A, E. So that's going clockwise. So they're a fifth interval away from each other if you were looking at them on the keyboard. When going counterclockwise, each key is a fourth above the last. So counterclockwise, C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat. They're fourths away from each other, a fourth interval if you're looking at them on the keyboard. In this version of the circle, as well as many others, the uppercase letters represent major keys and the lowercase letters represent their relative minor keys. Keys that are directly across from one another are tritones of each other. So C and F sharp. And tritones, like I said earlier, I think, when I was talking about intervals, tritones sound quite bad. They're dissonant. And you can read more about it here. I'll put the link in the description. It's a short article, and it's just worth understanding the circle of fifths because, like it says, Western music is based on the concepts within the circle of fifths. So it's helpful to understand. It's not totally important, but here's something that I find useful to understand. If you're looking at the C at the top of the circle of fifths, the lowercase a underneath it is A minor. And like I said a second ago, the A minor is the relative minor of C. So you can see every major key's relative minor. which is quite useful. So like A major has the relative minor of F sharp minor. And this diagram also shows the sheet music version of each of these keys. But for making music on a computer, you usually won't be using sheet music. Also, because the keys that are adjacent to one another, like if you're looking at C, the keys F and G and A minor, because they're adjacent to each other, they're quite similar in terms of the notes that are actually inside them. So basically, they don't sound too weird when you switch from, let's say, a C to a G key. When you're playing in the key of C and then you switch to G, it doesn't sound too weird because you're only changing one note. When you switch from C major to A minor, it doesn't sound weird because you're switching just the root note. And when you switch from C major to F major, again, you're only changing one note. It doesn't sound too weird. It's worth explaining automation. So this might look different in your DAW, but in Ableton, if you click on this little icon here, the two dots with the line between them, it shows you these little red lines. So you can choose a parameter. Let's say with our grand piano, let's choose the mixer. Let's go to track volume. You can click and break up the line here, and then basically automate different effects like the volume of the track. So that means that the track is going to rise in volume following this line as the playhead. That's activating these MIDI notes. As it moves from left to right, the volume is going to rise with the automation line. So I'll just play it so you can see. Okay, so that's automation. You can do a lot with that. Automation is very powerful, and it's definitely worth playing around with automating all of those different effects and seeing what you can do with them. There's one more thing I should mention before we talk about exporting, and that is loudness, because streaming platforms like Spotify and SoundCloud and YouTube will compress your audio if you don't control the loudness yourself. And basically that what that might do is decrease the dynamic range. Dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and quietest parts of the track. Platforms like Spotify, if they notice that your track is too loud, they'll push down the loud parts. It'll reduce that dynamic range. So you don't want that. It's good to go to your master track before you export and drop a limiter on and then a plugin. You can use a Julian loudness meter. That's what I use, or whatever else you want to use. Basically, this is a free plugin, the Julian loudness meter, and it's what I've been using, and it works quite well to just tell you some information about the loudness so you can control it and have it at the right levels. There's a few different terms to understand when you're controlling the loudness of your track. Various types of audio metering are employed to measure volume differently. Here are some key insights about different LUFS variations. LUFS stands for loudness units full scale. So integrated LUFS. Imagine you're working on a podcast episode. Integrated LUFS provides the average loudness of the entire episode, ensuring that it consistently sounds just right to your audience throughout the entire runtime. Short-term LUFS is referring to, in a music track, the chorus might have a sudden peak in volume. Short-term loudness units, full scale, capture these momentary changes, making sure that even quick spikes don't catch listeners off guard. Momentary LUFS measures the loudness of a sound snippet over an extremely brief period, typically around 400 milliseconds. This measurement provides an accurate indication of LUFS for individual moments within a track, but it isn't representative of the overall LUFS value for the track. LRA, loudness range, measures the difference between the loudest and quietest parts of a track, offering insight into the dynamic sound range. True peak measures the highest peak level of an audio signal after conversion to analog. It considers the fact that digital audio can sometimes create peaks exceeding the maximum level. The thing about true peak is that basically when an audio signal, when it's being converted from digital to analog, the thing that's making the sound has to interpolate between these little points of data. Sound waves are curvy. And basically when it interpolates, it creates a curve that rises above these two highest points of data, meaning that when the computer sees these 2 points of data are below the max volume allowed, it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong there, but the actual sound will be interpolated between those points and be louder than is appropriate. So you don't want that. So you should know the true peak before you export, so you know it's not too loud. And the integrated LUFS, which is basically the average. So those are the two important things really here. If you play your track and just let it play all the way through, you're going to see the average loudness of the track and the highest point. You might want to go on and learn about compression and how to basically master your track yourself and create the optimal volume and the sort of normalized volume across your track to keep the energy high and things like that. That's more advanced stuff that you would want to learn later, probably. But for now, it's just good to know that basic stuff. So if you click export, for the render track, you're going to choose the master. The master is basically the track that all of the other tracks channel through. So the last effect on your master track should be your loudness meter, because the audio signal travels from the left to the right through all of the effects from left to right. So the very last effect on your master effect chain should be your loudness meter, so that you're getting an accurate reading of the loudness, because some effects affect the loudness of the track. So you want to render the master track. You want the sample rate to be somewhere in the middle. Just choose 48,000. And I will show you a quick diagram of what bit depth and sample rate actually are. So it's to do with the way that the computer stores information about sound. Sample rate is how often the computer takes a sample of the audio. And the more samples, the more accurate and high quality the audio is. And the bit depth is basically on the y-axis, the amplitude of the wave, how granular the quantization is. The bit depth is how much granularity the samples have to be placed on the y-axis, and the sample rate is how often the audio is being sampled. And both of these contribute to the overall quality of the track. You're going to want a lossless file, meaning a type of encryption that doesn't lose data. You don't want like an MP3, because that gets rid of a lot of data. You want a lossless file type. So WAV is a good option. Bit depth, it's actually okay to leave it at like 24 or 16. It's not as big a deal as the sample rate or the file type. Once it's WAV and it's 48,000, bit depth of 16 is fine. Feel free to set it to 24, but 32 is probably overkill, as well as, these sample rates like 96,000 and stuff, that's over the top. And the dither is basically just like a very slight noise that's added to the track so that it masks any weird sounds, like tiny little sounds. It's not noticeable, it's not a problem. Masking is an important idea in music. Basically, you don't want elements of your track to be masked usually, because it means that it might as well not be there, because you can't hear it, because there's something operating in the same frequency range or something that's louder than it that just kind of drowns it out and you can't hear it. But with dither, it's fine. It's meant to be there. It's quiet. You can't really hear it, so don't worry about it. I just leave it as triangular, and then you can export and give it a name. I find that it helps when you're trying to come up with a name for a track. If you're making an instrumental and you don't know what to name it, because it can be hard to come up with names sometimes, go into your dank memes folder and find a funny name of one of your memes. If you name your meme files accurately, they'll end up usually with pretty funny names. So you're bound to find some bangers in there, like download bread. So that's now rendering out the file. And if you need a quick image to use for the video, or thumbnail for your music, for let's say SoundCloud or YouTube, you can go onto your browser and then look up certain images related to the theme of your track, and filter by public domain, and basically you can use those images without restrictions. You can edit them, you can just use them as is or whatever. That's a way of just getting a quick picture for your music. Of course, you could just make something yourself or whatever. I use Filmora as my video editing software. And I will actually show you something else that's important in terms of the quality of your track. Let's say you've gotten some image and you've created this image and audio combination, and you're happy, you're ready to export it to upload it on YouTube or whatever. You want to export the audio in a lossless format again. Don't forget, it's still important how you export it at the video stage. If you're converting it into a video, you don't want to lose the quality at this stage. So I've found that an AVI file rather than an MP4 file, an AVI file allows you to choose PCM, which is a lossless format for the audio, and increase the sample rate and the bit rate before you export, and you should be good to go. And that is everything. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful, and happy music making. And remember to have fun with it. Don't stress about getting really good really quick. Just enjoy the process. Listen to lots of music, get inspired, and have a good time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.